Hi everyone! In this video we are going to talk about one of the cloud design patterns for Azure, and today's pattern is going to be deployment stamp. We can use deployment stamp with any Azure resource or component like a VM, app service, API management, function app, or even with a data store like SQL Server. And it allows us to deploy multiple independent copies of your solution across different regions or in the same region. And each individual copy is called a stamp. We are going to get a lot of benefits by using deployment stamp pattern. One of them is improving the scalability of your solution. Also the ability to deploy multiple instances of your solution across different regions or in the same region, and also it allows you to separate and isolate your customers' data completely. Now let's go to the Azure portal and see how can we implement this pattern. Let's assume we have a scenario. We want to create an Azure App Service and a SQL Database and Application Insights instance. And of course, we can go ahead and create all of these resources using the Azure portal. However, we are not going to do that. What we are going to do instead is we are going to use an ARM template to create all of these resources for us, because it's very mandatory for using a deployment stamp to have ARM template for our stamp or our resources that we want to redeploy in different regions. Now, it's important to mention here that this ARM template will create a SQL database in general tier. So you might need to expect that you are going to spend some money on this. If you are not ready, just follow along with me and don't create these resources. So let's go ahead and deploy to Azure. Now let's fill in the parameters for this template. Let's select a resource group. Probably I need to create a new one. Let's call it stamp1. And let's select a username and password for our SQL database. It's important to mention here that the password has to be complex, otherwise the deployment of this template is going to fail. Now let's go ahead and create this template. Now my deployment is completed, and the first thing I need to do now is to go to the SQL database and scale it down. Because if you remember, this template that we have used is going to create a SQL database in a general tier, and we don't want to pay for that. So let's go ahead to the resource group and let's select the database instance and let's scale it down to the basic tier, which is going to be much more cheaper. And let's go ahead and apply our changes. My SQL database instance changes has took place. Now let's go back to the resource groups and see what resources has been created for us after we deployed the template. We have a stamp1 resource group here, and we have got Application Insights instance, App Service Plan, SQL Database, SQL Server, and App Service. So our architecture for this solution is pretty simple and straightforward. We have an app service hosted in an app service plan talking to a SQL database instance. But we all know that leaving our architecture like this is going to have a lot of limitations for our solution. And here is why deployment stamp pattern comes really helpful and handy, because it tries to solve all of these challenges and limitations of the architecture we are having at the moment. Now let's talk a little bit about the limitations of this architecture. First of all, scalability. Our architecture has an option to scale up, but it doesn't have an option to scale out across multiple instances. Since we have only one SQL instance and one Azure App Service, we only can scale our resources up to the next tier. But sooner or later, once we get a higher workload, we are going to reach the maximum scalability limit for those resources. Also, we cannot separate customers' data or isolate customers' data. Some clients have a requirement to keep their data isolated from other people's data, and our current architecture cannot fulfill their requirements. Also, we have the ability to handle single and multi-tenant instances. Some clients do have a requirement to own the infrastructure underlying the working solution. This is to make sure that other customers' workloads are not going to interfere or slow down their own workloads. And our current architecture just supports some multi-tenant instances where everyone's data is stored in the same SQL instance. Moving to the update frequency. Some clients may tolerate frequent updates to their solution without any problem, while other customers might have a really restrict requirements for the update frequency, and they can only accept one update every fortnight or every month. and it's going to be a challenge for us to meet both people requirements if we have everything in one instance. Finally, we have geographical restrictions. Some industries like finance or health might have requirements that restrict the data to be stored within the country's borders. And our current architecture is hosted in Australia East, then it won't be compliant for a global deployment for many countries around the world. So those are the limitations of the current architecture, and those are the challenges that the deployment stamp pattern is trying to solve. And now we are going to see how deployment stamp pattern is going to help us resolve all of these limitations. Now let's go back to the Azure portal and deploy one more deployment for these resources. Let's create a new resource group, call it stamp2. Could be in Australia East region or any other region. I'm going to leave it in Australia East and select a username as well and password. And remember, it has to be a complex password. And let's go ahead and create these resources. Now my deployment is completed, and the first thing I need to do now is to go to the SQL instance and scale it down. Scale it to the basic tier and go ahead and apply our changes. Now my SQL changes has completed. Now let's go back to the resource group and open the app service. And let's go ahead and browse this app service. And doing the same with the stamp1 resource group, going to the app service, and let's browse it as well. As you may notice here, these two web pages looks really identical, and it makes sense because it runs from the same sample. The only difference you may notice here is the URL difference, because each of these web pages is hosted in a different app service. So this is one of the scenarios that deployment stamp pattern can help to resolve. We can have as many stamps as we would like and assign each stamp to a set of customers or a single customer based on our requirements and their compliance requirements. And there is nothing wrong with that. Look at Dynamics 365 or Office 365, there is a URL difference for each client to join their tenant on Office 365. So some deployments you may be fine to having different URLs for different customers to log to their tenants. Now let's have a look at the deployment stamp architecture. And I've got this diagram from Azure Online documentation. As you can see here, we can have as many stamps as we would like, either in the same region or in different regions. Each stamp will have its own Azure App Service and the SQL Database instance, and it's totally isolated from other stamps. And it's going to be up to us to choose which stamp is going to support a multi-tenant deployment like stamp1, or which stamps are going to support a single tenant deployment like stamp2. And each of these stamps could have a different computing or processing power based on the requirements or based on the performance metrics. And as I mentioned before, each of these stamps will have its own URL that clients have to use in order to log into your system. However, in some situations, you might have a requirement that requires you to have a single URL for all clients to use across all stamps. And then you have to manage the traffic internally to route each client to the right tenant or right stamp. Let's go ahead and see how can we do this. Now let's go back to the Azure portal and create an Azure front door, which is going to help us to manage traffic routing between clients and different stamps that we have in our solution. And I'm going to create a new resource group for Azure front door. I'm gonna call it front door resource group. And I'm going to leave it in US East region. Now moving to the configuration. First thing we need to do here is to specify the front end or the host name for our front end. And this is going to be the single URL that all clients have to use in order to access our solution across different stamps. So I'm going to call it deployment stamp URLs. And then leaving everything else to the default values. Now let's add back in the pools. And given that we have 2 stamps for our solution, we are going to add 2 backend pools for this configuration. First one, we are going to call it backend pool 1. And in the backend pool, I'm going to choose app service and choose the host name, one of the Azure app services that we have, and leaving all values to the default values, changing the weight here to be 100. And let's add this backend pool. And again, leaving all of the configuration to the default values. And again, let's go ahead and add the second pool, backend pool. And let's select Azure App Service and let's select the second URL for our second stamp. And change the weight here to be 100 as well. And let's add the backend pool as well. Now let's go ahead and add routing rules. And I'm going to make it really simple, as if the traffic is coming on HTTP, I am going to route it to a certain stamp. And if the traffic is coming on HTTPS, I'm going to route it to a different stamp. So I'm going to call this one stamp 1 routing through HTTP only. This is a front-end domain that we've specified for our front door. And in the backend pool here, I'm going to select the backend pool 1 and select HTTP only traffic. And let's add this routing rule. And let's go ahead and add another one for HTTP traffic. Stamp 2 routing. And we select here HTTPS. And again, the same front-end domain. And for the backend pool, it's going to be backend pool 2. And select HTTPS traffic only. And let's go ahead and add this rule as well. Now let's go to next step and let's review and create our Azure front door. Now my deployment is completed. Let's go to the Azure front door and let's browse to the front end URL. And I'm going to browse it twice. One with HTTPS protocol, like this page, and the other one with HTTP only, because this is how I configured the routing configuration. Now we can't tell for sure if our routing configuration is working or not, given that it is still preserved the same front-end URL in both situations. So I'm going to go back to the Azure front door and do some routing configuration changes to help us see if our routing configuration is working or not. So let's go to the routing configuration and let's change it instead of forward to redirect. Before that, I need to copy the URL first. So let's go to the backend pool 1 and copy the backend host name. Then go to stamp rule routing 1 and change it to redirect. HTTP only traffic and replace the destination host with that URL. And let's go ahead and update this routing rule. And let's do the same with the stamp 2 routing. But first I need to copy the URL of stamp 2 and then go to stamp 2 routing, change it to redirect HTTPS traffic and replace destination host with that URL. And let's save our changes. Now my changes is completed. Now let's go to the HTTPS URL and let's refresh this page. And as you can see here, the URL redirected to one of the stamps. And let's do the same with the HTTP traffic only. Again, it gets redirected to a different stamp. This is to prove that our routing configuration is working well, and it's going to direct the traffic to different stamps based on the calling protocol, whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. So this was a really easy, simple, straightforward routing configuration. But in real life scenarios, you will have more complex routing configurations than that. That's why you will have to use of the rules engine configuration and bind it to the routing rules. So let's have a look. And let's go ahead and add a new engine configuration. Let's call it engine 1. And let's call the rule name rule 1. And in here, as you can see, we can specify different conditions based on device type, header, body, URL, path, whatever you like. And if the request met that condition, it's going to route the traffic to this destination based on our configuration. We can specify whether forward or redirect traffic to which backend pool and what protocol it will support. And this is not an Azure front door course, so we are not going to cover the engine configurations in detail, but you get the idea. It's working the same way the routing configuration works as I showed you in the HTTP and HTTPS traffic routing. Now let's have a look at the architecture after we have added the Azure front door to our solution. So this is the architecture diagram. I've got it from Azure documentation. And as you can see here, the front door plays as the single URL that all clients are going to use to access your solution. And based on the routing configurations you specify in here, you are going to route clients to different stamps. Also, the diagram shows you here a different scenario. If you are using an API management or Cosmos database, you are still able to route clients to different instances based on the routing configurations you specify in the front door. However, this orange section is not required in our solution that I demonstrated. Now you have two options. Whether you are happy for your clients to use different URLs to access their stamps directly, or you want them to use a single URL to access your solution, and then you are going to route them internally to their stamps based on the routing configurations you specify in Azure front door. Both options are available for you based on your preference and your requirements. Now I hear some of you asking, what is the best way we can use to deploy different stamps across regions? It's okay to deploy it manually if we have only 2 stamps, like I did in the beginning of this video. But what if we have hundreds or thousands of stamps? Are we supposed to do it and deploy it manually as well? And the answer is no. We can use Azure Deployment Manager to help us automate the deployment for our stamps across regions and for different resources. Deployment Manager primarily using 4 files: Topology Template and its parameter file, and Rollout Template and its parameter file. The Topology Template answers the question of what resources needs to be deployed and where we need to deploy them, while the Rollout Template answers the question of when we need to apply those changes and the pre-deployment and post-deployment conditions that needs to be applied. However, I am not going to demonstrate Deployment Manager in this video, but I am going to refer you to the Deployment Manager overview link in here, which is going to cover these 2 diagrams in more details. And I strongly recommend you to do this Deployment Manager tutorial if you are keen to learn more about it. Now let's have a look at this topology template. As you can see here, it includes different regions for our solution, and in each region includes different resources that needs to be deployed. This is going to make it easier for us if we wanted to launch a new region or have a new stamp for our solution, or when we want to deploy a particular service in one region. Now let's talk about some of the considerations you need to keep in mind when you implement deployment stamp pattern. First of all, deployment. As we said before, you should have templates for all resources you plan to deploy using deployment stamp pattern. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult for you to have or create all of these resources manually for each stamp. Then we have cross-stamp operations. This is when you have some requirements to run some queries across all stamps in your solution. And to achieve this, you can implement 2 ways. Either to implement or run each query in every stamp individually and then you aggregate the result at the end. Or you could consider replicate the data from each stamp to a central place like a data warehouse or something, and then you can generate your consolidated reports from the data warehouse. Moving to the scale out policies. You need to keep an eye on each stamp individually and see the consumption of each stamp and the performance metrics. Then you can automatically determine when is the right time to provision a new stamp and then redirect the new clients to the newly created stamp. Then we have cost, and something important to keep an eye on, because deployment stamp pattern deploying multiple copies of the infrastructure components And for every new stamp you are deploying, the cost is going to increase, so it's something important to keep an eye on. Then we have moving between stamps. We already know that one of the powerful features about deployment stamp pattern is that each stamp is deployed and operated individually. And if you have some requirement to move a tenant or a client from one stamp to another, it's going to be really difficult for you, and it's going to increase the complexity of your solution. Then we have traffic routing, and as we said before, we need to consider the traffic routing mechanism to route different clients to different stamps in our solution. Then we have shared components. We need to consider using CDN if we have a shared components that needs to be used or accessed from all stamps in our solution. Now let's talk about when we should be using deployment stamp pattern. First of all, when we have a natural limit on scalability. Like SQL Server, for example, you can scale your SQL instance up till a certain limit, and after that you cannot scale it up anymore. And this is one example when you should consider using a deployment stamp pattern. Also, when you have some compliance requirements that requires you to store some client's data away from other clients. Also, when you want to have some tenants of your solution running on a particular version, which is different than the other tenants of your solution. And this is a very useful use case you need to consider for deployment stamp pattern. Also, when you have a multi-region application, when you want to direct people or clients from certain countries to a certain stamps. Finally, when you want to achieve resiliency during outages. Stamps by nature are isolated, so if one stamp is down for any reason, other stamps will not be affected. Now let's see when we should not use deployment stamp pattern. If we have a simple solution, or if we have a system components that are really easy to scale out or up within a single instance, or when we need to replicate all the data across all deployed stamps, we should consider other patterns like geode pattern, and hopefully we are going to cover it in the future. Also, when we have a requirement or need to scale a certain components of our architecture and leave other components without scaling, deployment stamps are not going to be helpful in this scenario. Finally, if we have a static content solutions, you shouldn't be using deployment stamp with it. And at the end here, I have put a reference for the deployment stamp pattern in the Azure Online documentation if you want to go have a read. Now let's go back to the Azure portal and clean up all of these resources and go ahead and delete them. Now we are coming to the end of this video. I hope you have learned what deployment stamp pattern is about and how you can implement it in your solution. If you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the comments below, and thanks for watching.